right, welcome back to another episode of Rewiring Health. I am so honored to be joined by Colette Jane Fehr. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Kelly.
Yeah, I am very much looking forward to this conversation. I was just chatting with you for a little bit, but relationships can be so complex. And especially when maybe we are people and which is who have the propensity to abandon ourselves, which is many people that listen to my podcast. I've been there. I'm still recovering and working through that. But we're gonna talk about all those things. But before we get into that, can you tell me a little bit about your story and what led you to helping people in this way?
Yes, thank you. I love talking about this because this is really my passion. I've been there too, and I am also a work in progress, despite being a licensed couples therapist, and that this is what I do all day, every day. That humanity cannot be overcome by your professionalism or education, right? Because it's all in our nervous system.
Mhm.
But I actually got into this work specifically because of my own failed first marriage and very difficult divorce. And specifically because before I got divorced, and this is now 20 years ago, we went to a marriage counselor and it was a really bad experience. The person wasn't properly trained or qualified, in my opinion, to work with couples. And I didn't know anything about psychology or therapy at that time, but I could feel it even then, just the felt experience being in the room with this person. There were some things that were really unethical, borderline unethical. And, if I knew what I know now, I would have probably even reported the person. But suffice to say, it was such a bad experience and it did more harm than good that I came away feeling like, wow, this is such important work. And people who do this need to be really well trained and so careful with people and so ethical because people are inviting you into their private relationship, the most important thing in the world to them. And I really wanted to be able to help other people, those who do want to stay together, because that's not everyone, but for those that do, to be able to find their way back to connection. And I went to grad school after I got divorced, and it was a very difficult journey, but that's what first propelled me into this field.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And it's just like the sensitive subject matter. I mean, you talked about like having couples, like, I mean, that's there's so many nuances to that and so many perspectives and things that you're working through and it's so complex that you have to come out with that from a very like sensitive perspective. And it's such a shame that
Yes.
you had that experience and unfortunately probably many others did with that therapist. And like, I think it's so inspiring that now you know what it should not look like and to do
Yeah.
everything to help people get into a place where they can feel at peace in whatever
Yeah.
that looks like for them.
Exactly. And unfortunately, this practitioner is still cooking around.
Mm,
And, it is what it is. But I often hear people say, well, we went to couples therapy and it wasn't helpful. And
mm,
not that everyone can help everyone, right? Even when you're doing it right. But I use a method called emotionally focused couples therapy, which is the gold standard in evidence based treatment. And it's really about attachment,
mhm,
strengthening the attachment bond, helping couples get out of those stuck interactional cycles where
mm,
they're really going into some kind of fight or flight and protecting themselves and then triggering one another
mm,
into a place of disconnection. So we try to de escalate that pattern without judging or making one partner the bad guy.
mm.
Just really understanding the emotions that come up, the distress, learning how to regulate your nervous system, and to be able to send clear messages to your partner that honor yourself instead of abandoning yourself to keep the peace, and also honor the relationship.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And like you talk about attachment, can you talk about like are there attachment styles that people need to be aware of? And can you dive into that? Because I know that's a big aspect as far as like our subconscious beliefs and what we pull into our life. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that and how that impacts us and we may not even be aware of it and that it's
Yeah.
very much ruling kind of what's going on?
Yeah. So, and attachment styles have become so popular, and I have kind of a nuanced approach to it. So, first of all, the mainstream kind of pop culture version of attachment styles, there's really four, but people don't tend to get into the disorganized style as much because that's complicated. That's kind of a little bit of push and pull. But the main, obviously, we're all trying to be as securely attached as possible. And that's really when we feel a sense of emotional safety. We feel confidence in our bond. So little things don't tend to trigger us as deeply. And this comes from couples being sensitive and responsive to one another, accepting of each other's emotions. I express my needs to you. I don't demand them. I don't expect that every need I share will get met, but I expect that you, my partner, will listen. You'll make an effort to understand me, that we'll have an open dialogue, and that you'll share your needs with me, and I'll be just as responsive. And I do want to say for everyone that, you can be securely attached in one relationship and not as securely attached in another. And what I don't like about the pop culture, and I'll get into anxious and avoidant too,
Yeah.
is that people tend to think that this is a diagnostic label, or I'm anxious, or I'm avoidant, or I'm secure. And it's much more fluid than that. We can show up differently at different times of life. We can be secure or anxious or avoidant in different relationships. And also, these are all constantly in motion and open to change. So even if you are more anxiously or avoidantly attached, you can heal and grow throughout life to become more and more secure.
Mhm.
So let me just give something to anxious and avoidant as well.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
if you're not as secure, you may be either in insecurely attached styles, are anxious or avoidant. And in emotionally focused therapy, we tend to think about that as pursuing and withdrawing from a relationship dynamic. So if you're anxious, a little thing may send a signal that triggers abandonment fears, right? More easily than someone who's secure. Your partner makes a grouchy face and you think, oh no, what did I do? What did I do wrong? What do I need to do to fix it? And you're in your head with all of that. And somebody who's more anxious may tend to like really try to push or pursue their partner to resolve that, and will feel a lot of anxiety and tension inside until things are good again.
Yeah.
Whereas someone who's avoidant and tends to withdraw more is going to, in order to protect themselves in the relationship, see conflict and any tension as a threat and want to remove themselves until the tension passes and kind of go silent or shut down. Sometimes it's more of a trauma response, even, but a lot of times it's just, oh no, something conflictual is happening. This could make things worse. So I'm just going to like remove myself or withdraw until the tension passes. And what we find in relationships with these styles is that if you're more anxious or avoidant, that can be your default, where if things go badly, you kind of resort to those withdrawing and pursuing moves. And of course, the way life works, most of the time, somebody who's more anxious ends up with somebody who's more avoidant. And then our task, and my task in therapy, is to try to help couples just to make the relationship more secure so they feel more at peace with each other and more confident in the bond.
Yeah, thank you for describing those and also talking about the nuanced parts of it because it's so I can very much relate. There are definitely relationships where I feel very secure and I can feel in my nervous system, I feel safe and calm. And then there are other ones I can see where I go back to some of my older styles that I'm aware of. So I appreciate you saying that because I think that can be so confusing when you hear, it expressed where like, oh, I could see where I'm anxious avoidant, but then like, then what am I here in this dynamic? Like, and so to recognize that it's ebbing and flowing, it's very fluid. Like I think that's really good to understand and hear for many of us who think like, okay, I am this. And then a lot of times if you define as that, then you're going to box yourself into being only that and then continue on in that path.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And to your point, in my first marriage, looking back, I was really pretty anxiously attached.
Yeah.
And I think we all struggle with fears of rejection and abandonment. Every single person, even if you're pretty securely attached, it's in there, even if it's outside of conscious awareness. And I got married to my college boyfriend very young. My parents had gone through a bad divorce. And I was determined. What I learned from my parents' divorce was fighting is bad because, I'm half Italian, half Irish from New York. My mom's a lawyer, my dad's a doctor. So I had two very strong, intelligent, feisty parents.
Mhm.
So when things went south, there was a lot of fighting, and it was very scary for me as a kid, having had the first 10 years of my life was so stable, and my parents' marriage seemed good, even though I'm sure there were cracks that I just didn't detect during that time. And then everything kind of blew up. So in my early romantic relationships, I was really seeking secure attachment in a romantic partner. In both my high school boyfriend, who was an alcoholic, but at the time it just seemed like what everybody else did on a Friday night, and is now in recovery and doing great. And then my college boyfriend, who was very avoidant and had come out of his own family of origin dynamic, learning to avoid conflict in order to keep the peace, and was very dismissive of my feelings. So I just learned, and coming back to tying in some of the self abandonment, that I needed to do whatever made him want to be close to me. And that usually meant trying to be the cool girl, the phrase that was coined in the film and book Gone Girl about a decade ago, right? The girl who doesn't care, never gets upset, doesn't have a lot of needs.
Mhm.
She's so cool. Everyone wants to hang out with her. Right. And that's not who I am, because I'm human. I have needs and fears and wants and longings and things that would piss me off and upset me. But I basically try to keep them all in, and then they'd come out sideways.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing how how good you get at that, showing the world one version, but behind closed doors, the inner turmoil and everything it
Yes.
takes, and how much every time you silence yourself, every time you invalidate yourself or rely on somebody else to tell you how to feel, there builds up this resentment within yourself. It's like resentment and disconnection. And it's just, it wears on
Spot
you.
on. Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's exactly what I have a book coming out, but it's not coming out till next year, called The Cost of Quiet. And it's going to be exactly about that, that when you abandon yourself and self-silence to keep the peace and avoid conflict, you end up destroying your relationship with yourself, because there's so much resentment. It just accrues and calcifies until you're living in a cave of resentment permanently.
Mhm.
Even if the relationship could improve, you're so mired in that sometimes it's hard to break through once that sets in.
100%. Oh my gosh. And it's such a vicious cycle, because then that carries on to many other relationships as well. It's like if you're doing that in your most intimate relationship, then you can often just continue to rely on the external world to say how you feel, who you are, everything else. And you lose yourself
Exactly.
in the process. And
Yes.
I truly believe our soul is itching to be heard and felt and loved by ourselves. And it's like when we have that push pull, it's like just complete resistance that we're feeling in those
Yeah.
moments.
And
Mhm.
that's the most important part, really, is that we
Yeah.
live in integrity with our relationship with ourselves. And it's so helpful to me now that I live very differently. I communicate differently. I've been remarried for 8 years, with my husband for 12 years. I feel very secure in the relationship and very at ease, but I also show up totally differently. And it's so helpful to me that I had such an anxiously attached, more insecurely attached relationship in which I did self abandon. I learned from that I can't do that to myself again, no matter what kind of relationship I'm in. And I really learned through the a little test tube, if you will, of those years in the middle when I was dating, and having some people who are not emotionally available enough for me to communicate my needs and feelings, and having to really choose to stick with me and say it anyway, even when it wasn't received well. And ultimately, one relationship in particular, I walked away from someone I really loved because He could not even honor smaller boundaries. It was always like, I don't know what you're talking about. This isn't a thing, and it's easy to say, screw that when you're not involved. But when your heart's on the line and you feel in love with someone, it's very hard not to just say, well, do I really need that? Is that really that important? Couldn't I live without that? He's not cheating on me. It's not that big of a deal. We can dismiss ourselves.
100%. Yeah. And trying to make a deal with yourself to make something external work when it's not working inside. And it's like your mind is fighting with your inner knowing. And that is such a hard place to be in when you're going through that. And just continuing on with that until you do wake up. And I love how you say that, like, you wanted something, but then it's like when you would set those boundaries and then it finally ended, like you're loving this person, but then you're also kind of letting them go in the process. Can
Yeah,
we talk about that a little bit more? Because I think this is something that isn't talked about enough. Like, there's so much
I
empowerment,
agree.
like set boundaries, love yourself, really embrace yourself. But then we don't talk about the backlash of those boundaries. The when you do stand for yourself, when people were used to you caving, what that does in dynamics, what that does externally. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, you're right. We don't talk about it enough. It's really difficult.
Mhm.
And it's one of those things that the only way to get more comfortable choosing yourself, because that's what I see a boundary is just choosing yourself over and over and in small ways, right? Many of us have boundaries, even if we haven't stated them explicitly. Like, okay, if you cheated on me, or if went off somewhere for the weekend and didn't call me, more extreme things that were like, I wouldn't put up with it. But what about the little things? What about when somebody, let's just take something small from like a dating thing. What about when somebody says, oh, I don't really, let's say you're dating and somebody expresses to a partner, I really like to talk on the phone. I don't want to just text. That doesn't feel connected to me. And that person you express that to just kind of continues to go, oh, yeah, yeah, okay, but nothing changes. Or, I'm busy. And I do love to think about, I don't even know if you're familiar with this because you're probably a lot younger than I am, but about 20 years ago, this book came out, He's Just Not That Into You.
I
Do you
read that.
remember
Yes,
that?
I do
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
that. Yes.
yeah.
Yep.
And, that was kind of the beginning. And obviously, it doesn't have to be male, female. It can apply
Mhm.
to any and all relationships. But if somebody really, if you're important to someone, they should want to hear your feelings and needs. They should want to make an effort for those things. And it doesn't mean we're asking anyone to abandon themselves either. But if I'm dating you and you tell me, hey, Colette, I'd really love to like chat here and there and not only communicate by text, and I'm invested, I'm happy to say, okay, I'm just flying around like crazy, but I can make time for you because you're important to me. So, what do you do if it's something like that that matters to you and you're involved with someone who just doesn't seem to care? And sometimes they just can't hear you because their own defenses are up.
Mhm.
This is when you have to really dig deep and decide, how important is this to me? And really be honest with yourself, because it may mean losing a relationship, it may mean pulling away. But I have to say, once I changed my attitude towards this and started, you don't want to fight every battle, but if something really matters, then I am going to fight to be heard. And it's my job to show up as clearly as possible and then to make decisions based on what I receive. So, what I think it really comes down to is you've got to process with yourself first how you really feel and be honest and what really matters.
Mhm.
And then when you do that, you have the clarity and the confidence to come forward with a clear signal, meaning you don't let your emotions hijack you. You allow your emotions to be, but you speak for them, not necessarily through them. And you let someone know, when you don't make time to call, I feel hurt and disappointed because I've communicated it. And then it sends a message to me that I'm not that important to you. And that makes me question the relationship. You may think it's not that big of a thing, but to me, it does matter. And it also signifies more about our relationship and our patterns,
Mhm.
right? So you come forward like that and you still may not get hurt. I think this is the biggest thing that people get frustrated with. Everyone wants to know, well, how do I say it so I get through? You're clear, you're vulnerable, you're honest, and you're kind. Those are my 4 principles that I think we should always be communicating with. That gives you the best chance possible to be heard, but it doesn't guarantee that you're heard or you get what you want. What it does guarantee is that you're giving yourself the best chance that your needs will be met, and you're going to get information about what this partner can and can't offer you, and you can make decisions with that information.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that explanation. I think it's really so important what you just said because it's not about controlling what the other person is going to do. It's about empowering yourself. And I think it can be so easy to be like, but I want them to do this. And then it's almost like it becomes a push-pull dynamic versus like you standing in your power, in your agency, and then being like, okay, if you fit this, then we can go forward. If you don't,
Yeah.
then maybe we can't. And so
Right.
I love that. It just it feels like even just how you describe it, it feels empowering versus like, okay, I'll let them make the decision. It's like when you typically self-abandon, you're like, okay, I'll just, if they just want to text, we'll just text, like whatever makes them happy. And like it can be really challenging to get into that place, but yet so, so good. And so much like you got yourself.
Yes.
And I think so
Yes.
many of us, I think women especially, will relinquish our power for somebody else.
Yeah, we're conditioned to be people pleasers, to be
Mm,
nice, to be
yeah.
kind, to not make people feel badly. And, this example I just used, I went through,
Mhm,
and I really, I had moments where I found myself begging, essentially, over explaining, pursuing, trying to get the person to do what I wanted them to do because I didn't end the relationship. But the difference is, that as I was more accepting of myself and more self-aware, I noticed what I was doing. I gave myself a lot of grace and a lot of compassion, that the relationship was important to me, and of course, I was wanting to make it work, but I was also able to see that I was crossing a line for myself,
mhm,
and I finally just said, look, like this is important to me. And I find myself doing these things and I don't want to. And if this is something that you can't or won't do, then I think it's just not going to work for me, that my needs probably won't be met in the relationship. And
mhm,
ultimately I had to let the relationship go. So I was sad. But to your
mhm.
point about empowerment, I felt so strong and good that I showed up for myself, that it was 100% worth it.
Yeah, I love it, and thanks for sharing that too, because I think it's important to know that, like, you can feel empowered and still feel sad. Those can coexist. So I think
Yes.
sometimes we get stuck in that too. I am either sad or I am either good, like, but you can have those mixture of emotions in everything in life. Everything is just has its polar
Yes.
ends. Yeah.
Yes, I so agree, and I think that when we do this kind of work of showing up for ourselves as women, and really forsaking the temptation and the societal pull to people please and be nice at all costs,
Mhm,
you are going to have those conflicting emotions. It's going to feel uncomfortable because it runs so counter to some of our programming. You
mhm.
may lose a relationship or a friendship or, something. You may upset someone, but we've got to develop a muscle to tolerate discomfort too. And that's a big part of walking the boundary walk.
Yeah, absolutely. And going off of that, how important was cultivating self-worth within yourself in that? Because I think that's for me, in my experience, when I had lower self-worth, it was really hard to advocate for myself because I didn't think I was worthy of it. So can you talk about your experience? How
Yeah.
did that evolve? And how did your behaviors, your thoughts, your beliefs evolve as you had more self-worth?
Yeah, I love that you said that, Kelly. It gave me goosebumps because I
Oh,
do think that's the core.
mhm,
And you don't have to be the most confident person. Self-worth is exactly what it sounds. It's just believing you're worthy. And I believe, and I don't even think this is my theory, right? This won't be a surprise to you. We're worthy just by virtue of breathing.
mhm,
So there's really nothing you have to attain. It doesn't matter who you are. It's what it is to be human, that you're entitled to your feelings, your experience, your wants, your desires. We don't expect as mature adults that everything we want happens, but we should be able to put all of that out there and stand by it. So I think that I agree with you. My self-worth wasn't where it needed to be early on. And so I would receive a lot of messages. I am a very expressive person. And, I like acting and creative writing. And I'm just a very passionate person and I'm very emotional. So I would date men who were more avoidant or withdrawn or emotionally unavailable. And throughout my younger years, I would constantly hear that I was emotional, irrational, dramatic. Um, all that kind of stuff. And in particular for my ex-husband, a lot of messaging because he wasn't comfortable with his own emotions. He was disconnected from his own experience. But you hear that enough from someone you love in conjunction with society praising people who are calm, cool, and collected. And I wasn't like a nut job or anything, I would do a pretty decent job expressing myself, but anytime there was emotion, even just sadness, it would be like, whoa, 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 whoa. So I started because I lacked the self-worth to say, like, you know what, this is how I feel. And you may not agree with it or be able to hear it or take it in, but I know that I am worthy of having and communicating this experience.
Mhm.
So I came out of that marriage really kind of beat up around all of that emotionally and questioning myself and feeling initially like, okay, I got to control all of that. And then what happened is I just realized through dating and messing it up a lot that I had to really own that, you know what, I'm not going to take in those messages like being dramatic because I think that's kind of condescending and dismissive. But then I am emotional and it's one of the most beautiful parts of my personality. It's how I can connect deeply to people. And I'm going to probably end up with, I'm heterosexual. So in my male female relationships, because I am so warm and expressive and connected, I may end up with men who are a little more logical and withdrawn. Just, relationships try to have a balanced system, but that I'm not going to dismiss my own feelings. And I'm also going to recognize that at times my partner may struggle to understand the depth of how I feel.
Mhm.
And so that as you do that, as you choose to, even in a small example, say, hey, you know what? I'm tempted to sweep this under the carpet, but I really feel like I need to tell you how I feel. And I'm a little scared to tell you. And it's really good. I encourage everyone to name their fear in the moment when you share something with a romantic partner or significant other, because it helps, as you know, it helps regulate your system to name that fear in the moment. And it also helps regulate your nervous system to name and organize your feelings. And every time you do that, not only do you build your confidence in communicating, but you build your self-worth. Every time you show up for you and stand in your truth and that empowerment, you feel more worthy inside. And now I feel like my self-worth is here. I mean, I just had my 51st birthday yesterday. And I posted a picture of me in like a bathing suit with fat rolls. If you had told me that I would do that, you know, 35 pounds ago and 20 years ago, I would have been like, no way. I just feel comfortable in my own skin. And that's been lots of reps of doing these hard things.
I love that. And I feel like that's contagious. Like, I think if more women could just be, here I am, like that, I love myself and I don't care what your judgments are or anything. Like, I know who I am. I know my truth. That's like, that is so contagious. And I think that needs to be expressed more so in this world of like, you don't have to obtain all these things to be worthy. Like, you have it right here and you just have to own it. And there's just so
Yeah.
much that's in that, and that it really becomes contagious. So I appreciate you sharing that message because I really believe that, like, hopefully some female listens to this and is like, oh, okay, like I can enjoy my life. I don't need to lose, weight. I don't need to make more money. I don't need to get a different job, have a different title. Like, I can start living my life and enjoy it right now and be worthy right now. So
Yes. And
I
feel worthy. And
yeah.
I think that, along those lines, we do probably still care if we're honest to some degree. And I think that's important to say too. I'm not so confident that as I posted that picture, I didn't think like, oh God, people are gonna like see how fat I look in a bathing suit. I mean, just to be honest, of course I did. That goes through my mind. But then my answer to that is, you know what? It's okay. It's okay. Like I'm doing this for me. And that does hurt a little, that thought, but
Mhm.
I'm still going to take the positive, empowered action. So I also think it's important that we really share that nobody, unless you're a sociopath or a malignant narcissist, nobody doesn't care at all or feels perfectly confident. We're human. We have self doubt. We get insecure. But I think what makes us feel more worthy and have greater self esteem and self worth is doing it anyway, choosing to love yourself. I think it's a real action.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, and I love how you said that, like, fear is natural because it's not about being fearless, it's about recognizing fear and, like you said, doing it
Doing
anyway.
it anyway.
That's like, now you're choosing it. You're not letting society, like, say, "Oh, I shouldn't do this." Like,
Yeah,
if you feel confident you wanna do that, like, that's your choice, even
exactly.
if it's fearful. So I love
Yes.
that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I don't know, did you ever read the book by Susan Jeffers, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway?
I haven't read that one yet. I'll
Okay,
have to
it's
do it.
from 30 years ago,
Yeah.
but it changed my life. So for some of your listeners, it's been reprinted. She has since died of cancer. She was an amazing psychologist, and it's such a foundational book for me. I think I read it right after my divorce, and I was like, "Oh, I can be brave and afraid."
Mm.
And I'm a very fearful person. I really am, but I'm also a very courageous person. So it really is like we don't have to get rid of fear. We just have to be willing.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And to learn and grow from that as well, like recognize it
Yeah.
and evolve as we go throughout that. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I want to dive into something that you talk about
Yeah.
because I think this will be very interesting for people to hear more about.
Yeah.
Good segue here, but red flags and green flags. So can you talk about that with dating? Because I think this is something I haven't dated in a while, but like, that would have been something that would be useful when you're going through that. What are the signs that I'm looking for that this feels
Mm.
right, is aligned, or maybe this is not aligned?
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. So I wish I had figured out my own red and green flags back when I was dating. But like most things, you learn through trial and error, right?
So
So
true.
I think there's nothing more important in a relationship than emotional responsiveness and attunement. And so what I mean by that is finding somebody who doesn't totally shut down, flee, yell, lose their temper when emotions happen, but somebody who wants to lean in with you or at least do the work to make that easier. Because many people grow up in households where emotions weren't dealt with at all, and they're just afraid of them and don't even realize that. But that is the heart of connection. So, in terms of a red flag, I would say, first of all, that's just kind of my umbrella issue. But then let me dive in a little deeper. Red flags, first of all, inconsistency, right? Somebody who is hot and cold, they're communicative, and then suddenly they're not. And then there's always a perfectly plausible excuse. The more tuned in you are to your nervous system, the more you're going to notice. How do you feel inside when you're with this person? How do you feel when you're not with the person? Pay attention to those things because your body will tell you. And it's very tempting early on. Oh, well, we're not really that committed yet. Or, oh, especially in this era of online dating,
Yeah.
people pop in and pop out and they're really on fire with you. And then they kind of ghost for a little while and then they're back. Oh, sorry, I was busy. No, no, no. That is a flag. It
Mhm.
should feel consistent and normal. There should be communication. If they say they're going to call and don't, I'm so sorry. I got stuck here. I can call you at this time. Look for consistency and reliability. And if you're not seeing that early on, it's a huge red flag. So that's one. The second is anytime there's an issue, does that person avoid it, run away from it, dismiss it, or do they dive in and want to have a conversation? Do they want to hear?
Mhm.
right? I mean, that is the biggest green flag out there. Someone who's willing to be vulnerable, right? Like that's the love language.
Yes. Yeah. In
Yeah,
many
and they're
dynamics.
out there. Yes,
Yes.
they're out there. I mean, I have
Mhm.
couples, so many
Yeah.
same sex, heterosexual couples,
Mhm.
where there are plenty of men out there who are willing to be vulnerable. You know, there are women who are afraid to be vulnerable. This is not like a male female thing as much as people think.
Yeah.
But whoever you date, you know, non binary, male, female, look for those partners, the green flag of being willing to be vulnerable, talk about their feelings, and being willing to listen.
Mhm.
That is like the thing that's going to make or break your relationship so much more than finances, hobbies, any of that stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for sharing those because it can get like you get very confusing, especially if it's a newer relationship, like trying to figure out where you fit in that, or even if it's like an existing relationship or family dynamics or whatever it is, it's like to recognize like I think it's also that self-validation of like, okay, this is what I'm experiencing. And this is why my nervous system feels the way it does.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah, so I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's just really great kind of place for people to maybe start self-reflecting.
Yes. And I
Yeah.
really want to say too, let's empower women in particular and men too, everyone, but
Mhm.
really for women, because I think it is so hard. Nobody wants to seem difficult, right? As women, if we push back, we're so quickly labeled difficult. If we're assertive, we're so quickly labeled aggressive or a bitch, right? There's still
Mhm.
all these nasty bullshit labels out there that are so unfair to women. And I think it's really hard when you're dating and it's kind of a subtle inconsistency or a subtle lack of follow through, or you notice you bring something up and the person's like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, I hear you. Are we good now? Are we ready to move on? It's so hard to stand up and say, you know what? This is what I'm experiencing. When I bring things up, I notice you seem to want to skate right by. I notice that you don't always call when you say you will, or we have a great date and then I don't hear from you for a few days. And I want to be open and ask you about that if you're noticing those things too, but also to let you know that those things don't feel good to me. And so I really want to explore if you and I can be on the same page or not. That is, we need to do that as women. You're not difficult. You're not too much. You're reflecting back it's your experience. No one can take that away from you. And do not be afraid of some person who hasn't done their own work to be able to hear that message. Because somebody who's healthy will say, oh, wow, thank you for sharing that with me. Let's talk about it. You know, I didn't realize, or right, it's something, or you're going to have a conversation. They're going to tell you what you want to hear, and then they're going to keep doing it. And you're going to say, okay,
Mhm.
I showed up. I was clear. I communicated, and now I'm still getting this. So, what
Mhm.
do I want to do with that?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so good. And it's like such a great message too, because a lot of the people that self-abandon, myself included, you tend to be more empathic. So you can be very susceptible in relationships where you're maybe placing the blame on yourself. Like, oh, they didn't call me. Did I say something? Oh my gosh, did I not do the right thing? Like, was it something I said or wore that night? Like you can very much put the blame on yourself. So
Totally.
yeah, so I think it's so important that message you just said of like realizing that if you're doing the work and someone's healthy on the other side, they will receive those things. Like
Yes.
I think we all need to
Yes.
hear that in so many dynamics, and like,
Yes.
it's not our fault if they're not receiving them and not
Right.
open to that.
Exactly. And that's the value of saying it clearly,
Mhm,
kindly, vulnerably, and honestly,
mhm,
right? You're not saying you do this and I really hate it and criticizing and blaming, but
mhm,
you're also not being passive aggressive about it and hoping they're going to read your mind and figure it out
mhm,
because nobody can. It's hard enough to figure out what your own self feels and needs and wants and
mhm.
thinks.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just too difficult for other people. You know, that's another big thing that younger people and even people my age and beyond, if they don't challenge those thoughts, it's like, well, I said it once, or, you know, this is how relationships go. Everybody's got different expectations. You know, some people grew up in totally detached, disconnected homes. They don't understand constant communication or connection. They've never even learned that. And they may be very open to it if they understand why it's important to you, or they may not, but they
Yeah.
won't know if you don't tell them clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And then even if it doesn't work out, I know it's like that communication. If you speak, you're like, well, I said what I could say. And then it frees you too from being like, I put in everything I could have done. I couldn't have said anymore. So they took it as they took it. So
Exactly.
yeah,
And you feel
yeah.
good that you communicated in a really mature adult way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can also rest easy too, going off of that. Like I've had a situation where that I did was not met with very nice energy and very, some awful things were said, but I'm like, I'm going to stand in my space. I will be respectful. I will be very stern with what I say, but respectful. And it's given me a lot of freedom in that case of like, I don't have to apologize for the way I handled myself because I wouldn't have done it any differently. And
Yes.
it's so
Yes.
freeing. You don't have to go down to the level if you're being met with some of these things. So,
Totally agree. And also, let's acknowledge that we're gonna mess it up too.
mhm,
I just recently, and I do this for a living, and I've been working on this for a long time, but I was hurt by somebody
mhm,
and I expressed myself, but I was so hurt. I probably didn't wait for my emotions to simmer down enough.
mhm,
And I wasn't ugly, ugly, but there was one thing I said that was a little bit to the person and a
mhm.
dig and not my best foot forward.
Yeah.
And so I said what I said, and I was drawing a boundary. And then I sat with it over the next few days. And I was like, I still believe everything I said in terms of like what the boundary needs to be and where I felt that this person had disrespected me. But I didn't like the way I communicated all of it. And so this is another place where you have to be really connected to you and trust your self-worth, because I think there was a prideful part of me that was like, well, if I apologize for how I said it, then it's going to sound like, I'm taking the whole thing back, or I'm letting them get away with it or something. And I said, no, you know what? The biggest reason I'm apologizing is for me, because
Mhm,
I care about my own personal integrity. And I didn't like that I communicated that way. And so I wrote this person a note and I said, I just want to say that when I communicated this to you, I think that I don't like the way I said it. I shouldn't have said this. I shouldn't have called you this. That was beneath me and not fair to you. And so for that, I'm sorry.
mhm,
And that felt good to me because I took accountability for the part where I didn't handle myself well. And the person accepted my apology, but then also, interestingly, didn't apologize for anything back, didn't address it. And the reaction I got to everything was, wow, you're so upset with me. This seems like a little over the top.
mhm,
And, so at this point, I'm on good terms, but like, I'm not going to continue to be close to this person because I felt really disrespected. I didn't communicate it with an A plus. I would give myself like a B. And I took ownership of what I could do better. I learned from it.
mhm.
And I apologized for that part, but I'm still standing in the boundary because I don't want to be I don't want to be close to someone who disrespects me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that example because it's so relatable. I think we've all been there,
Yeah.
but like just to be able to differentiate the message versus the delivery
Yes.
and also give yourself permission to hold that boundary, but also
Yeah.
have that self-awareness to take that accountability. So I love that. And I want to ask a question about that because
Yeah.
if you're in a
Yeah.
relationship where maybe you are very self-reflective and you can bring that awareness to yourself, but you're with somebody who is either unwilling or unable to reflect on anything they've done. Can that ever work? Or what does that look like? Or how do you move forward with somebody like that?
Sorry, I'm still coughing. I had COVID a couple weeks ago and it's not like the
Oh,
cough is
yes.
lingering. Yeah. I'm laughing because I feel like that's sort of my marriage to a degree.
Yeah.
My husband is a CFO numbers guy. He's Mr. Spreadsheet. He's willing to try, but it is not his natural wiring.
Mhm.
He's developed more self-awareness, but it's never going to be his default. He just doesn't have that. Like, we're therapists. Like, I feel like therapy attracts people who really are aware and want to be
Mhm,
more aware and tune in. So I think it can work, but I think there's got to be some acceptance that
mhm,
not everyone is going to be as adept at that or as inclined that way. But also asking a partner, can you make some effort, even though this isn't your way? When
mhm.
I bring something, are you willing to reflect on what I bring? If I have a legitimate complaint and let's say you don't agree with me, are you willing to give it some thought and consideration?
Mhm.
I'm always like, I want to work on myself forever. Even if I weren't in a relationship, it's just like I'm my biggest remodel project.
Oh, I totally get it. Yes. Yep.
And my husband's not that way, and I'm not going to be able to change who he is, but he's willing at least to meet me in the places that I ask him to go to look at what can strengthen the relationship. Now, if somebody's not even willing to like hear you and self-examine at all, I think that's tough. If
Mhm.
you grow beyond a partner, that can really lead to a relationship organically dissolving or at least becoming very disconnected over time.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love how you talk about the willingness. Like, even if you don't have maybe the capacity or it's not something that's natural to you, but
Natural.
just having that willingness to listen to your partner and respect them enough to at least put in some effort.
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
yeah, I
exactly.
yeah, I love that, and I appreciate you saying that because, like, again, it's nothing is cut and dry, like, relationships are so nuanced, so there's not, like, any prescription for how you handle anything, but it's, like, these messages of, like, "Okay, what's best for me?" And I think that's the overarching, like, theme of a
Yes.
lot of this is, like, how can I be aligned with my truth and be able to be in my own agency and be okay with that? I lo
Exactly. And
I love that.
all these things we're talking about,
Mhm.
owning when you mess up and apologizing for that part while you stand in your truth,
Yeah.
saying something that you'd rather avoid because you think you're not going to get a good reaction. Every single time you do one of those things,
Mhm.
that's what builds your self-worth and your
Mhm.
self-confidence.
Absolutely, and then starts to rewire the brain that maybe you've had for 40, 30, whatever years that
Yes.
wasn't doing that, so you literally start to rewire yourself as you're doing that, which is so
Yes.
profound, and then becomes more the natural state, so I
Yes.
love it. For somebody who's listening and they're like, "Okay, what do I do? What's my first step? What's something I can do today to just move myself forward just a little bit?" What would you say to that person who maybe has self-abandoned for much of
Mhm.
their life? They feel kind of disconnected from themselves. They feel maybe some resentment because they've done that, and they want something different. They wanna feel more free and really get in touch with themselves. What can they do today to start that?
I love this question. I think it all starts with how you talk to yourself inside your head and
Mhm,
to really start with self compassion. And this is something, many people beat themselves up,
mhm,
dismiss themselves, they make a mistake, they're so hard on themselves. And often this is the vestige of childhood part of self that developed. When you didn't have a wise, loving, mature adult that is you to
mhm,
be there with you. We develop as kids ways to try to motivate ourselves to do better, to avoid the wrath of an angry parent. And then we carry those voices into adulthood. And what people don't realize, even though it's so default, is that if today you start to tune in and just notice your dialogue, and every time you say, God, what an idiot, why did you say that? You notice that and you go, oh, wow, right? Mindfully aware, not judging yourself for saying that, just saying, there I go, telling myself that I'm an idiot. What could I say instead that would be kinder and nicer? And I like to, and I'm sure you have this same thing, I like to have people think about what would they say to their daughter, their sister, their best friend, because we have an easier time accessing that compassionate voice when we think about somebody else we love, and
mhm,
a much harder time when we think about doing it and giving it to ourselves.
mhm,
But it
mhm,
is as simple as saying the positive, compassionate message to yourself, either out loud, talking to yourself is very healthy, or internally. Your subconscious mind believes whatever it hears repeatedly. It doesn't discern context or it doesn't care. If you tell your subconscious mind Santa Claus is coming on July 25th now instead of December 25th, eventually that's going to seem like the truth.
mhm.
So, whatever it hears, and it's really hard to find the courage and the willingness to like step up and really show up for yourself if you're constantly beating yourself up in your own head. So
Mhm.
I would really start with writing a couple of affirmations, positive statements that are self-loving around things about which you feel insecure or repeated things you tell yourself that are negative, and say those things 3 times a day for 30 days. And you're going to notice a difference between how you feel about yourself in that area today versus how you feel 30 days later. And keep doing that, because
Mhm.
that's how I really got here, is by changing the way I talk to myself inside. Instead of being like, God, Colette, that is so dramatic. And maybe you shouldn't feel that way. I started saying, you know what? I'm feeling intense emotion about this for a reason. My system's telling me something. Let me
Mhm.
get curious. Let me care about my own feelings. I have a right to this. This is important. I completely changed that inner dialogue.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Sometimes it's just that little foothold that really just allows us to change the trajectory of our life. So I appreciate you giving someone just something so tangible that they can start doing today. So thank you.
Yes, yes. And shout out to the book Self Compassion by Kristen Neff, which
Mhm.
I don't know if you've read that, but it's a
Haven't read that
great,
one yet either. Yeah.
yeah, it's really good. And she was
Mhm.
sort of the foundational researcher on self compassion. And she gives a lot of information on how to implement this and change your inner voice. And it's just a really great book.
Yeah, amazing. It's like amazing how books, like I'm a big reader myself, they can change your whole life once you read them. So
Yes.
I love that you shared two good books that people can also
Yeah.
grab as resources. And also, for someone who want to connect with you, where can they find
Yeah.
you and share that?
Yes. So I am on all the social media platforms, Instagram in particular, at Colette Jane Fehr,
Mhm.
and Colette with just one L. Fehr is Fehr. And my website is colettejanefehr.com. And I will have a book coming out on this topic, on really showing up for yourself and communicating for connection, called The Cost of Quiet. I'm breaking the cycle of conflict avoidance, but it will not be out till next year. So if you follow me on Instagram or sign up for my newsletter on my website, you'll see information about that. And then I also have a podcast that I do with a co-host, Laura Bowman, who's another licensed therapist. And this is specifically for women at midlife. And we cover all the topics. It's called Insights from the Couch, Mental Health at Midlife, Anxiety, Attachment Styles, Relationships, Menopause, Perimenopause, you name it, women's stories about reclaiming themselves, divorce, dating. So check that out too. That's available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Amazing. I'll put everything in the show notes. So if you're listening right
Thank
now, definitely
you.
check that out. And I am so grateful for everything you shared today, Colette. It's been amazing just chatting with you and being able to share this with more people.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved it. These are such important messages. And as women, we need to support each other and have each other's backs, because it's hard to do this, but it's so rewarding. So I hope everyone who's listening feels a little boost of inspiration or motivation to speak up for yourself.
Yeah, that's it. I find these messages can't be said enough. And the more you hear them, the more they do get ingrained in your mind. So
I agree.
again, thank you so much. I've truly enjoyed this.
Thank you, Kelly. Me too.